Hello, everyone. For those of you I have not met, I am Guy Crain. I'm the philosophy professor here at Rose State. I'm going to be presenting to you today about taming tough topics. I want to talk to you about why I do the things that I do in the classroom and tell you some of the things that I do that I've had a lot of success with. I realize that, well, none of you are philosophy professors, but in most of the methods that I've used, it seems pretty clear to me ways in which what I do could be adapted to all kinds of different fields, both towards deeper into the humanities than me and even farther towards the hard sciences. I kind of deal with all of that in class. I want to start by talking about, my plan is to present to you kind of everything that I do. I'm happy to take questions at the end of that, and then I actually want to give you a first-hand sort of taste. We'll have an activity at the end of that, a first-hand taste of kind of undergoing some of the sort of methods that I employ in class. So I want to start by talking about why are hard topics so hard? Why is it the case that there are these topics that just seem like hot potatoes, that seem off limits, that already seem like you're holding a landmine, that you can hear the ticking or something? I'm sure that there are lots of reasons, but I want to talk to you about the one that I take to be primary and what drives most of my methods then. And that is this, and that is that people tend to have tribal sorts of leanings, that we are humans in virtue of the fact that we have a tendency to form groups and be very clear about who is in our group and be very clear about who is not in our group. And I'm not sure I'm telling you anything that's particularly news to your life. As you can imagine, that people get very worked up about all of these things, not just about politics, not just about sports, but about the degree to which you prefer sparkly vampires to werewolves, both of which are dripping with teenage angst. And people get very passionate about these things. I'd like to suggest, while this seems very intuitive to the common person's experience, I'd like to suggest to you that this problem goes much deeper than you think, that human beings' tendencies to be tribal, to form groups, is perhaps much more easily triggered than you might think. I want to talk to you about a couple of studies that were conducted by social psychologists, particularly a pair, Tajfel and Billig. What they decided to do was take a group of folks and in one case have them look at pairs of paintings and then ask them which of two paintings they preferred, and they would go through multiple sets. And at the end, the paintings, by the way, happened to be real paintings by real artists. And at the end, say, of a dozen or 24 different pairings, they would tell these people, oh, seems like on average you prefer Kandinsky paintings or you prefer Klee paintings. Well, what was funny is that was a lie. They were randomly assigned into groups after that. But now, this person who had gone through the little exercise says, oh, I'm a Klee fan or I'm a Kandinsky fan. In another case, they had folks just look at a page of dots and asked them, well, how many dots do you think that there are? Just guess. And after they guessed the number of dots, the experimenters told these people, oh, you tend to be an overestimator, or you tend to be an underestimator. Now notice in both of these cases, it seems as though the participants really did sort themselves into groups. It really was up to me to say what my preferences were like. And so Billig decided to conduct this little follow-up study here under even more flimsier grounds of forming groups. What Billig decided to do is give participants no control whatsoever, but just tell participants, you're in group W and you're in group X. Okay, in all of these cases, the experimenters told the participants, listen, I'm going to give you a second task to do, and it's completely unrelated to the first, but it makes things much, much easier on us researchers if we can just keep the groups the way they were on the first task. Is that okay with you? Well, again, that was a lie. They were randomly assigned to different groups in the second part, and the second task was super duper related to the first task. What they had these people do was sit down and look in a book where they were going to give real people real money. So they looked in a book where they never got to give themselves money, but they got to see different ways of splitting money between members of their own group and members of the other group. So they saw something perhaps like this, where here, you need to pick one of these options. You could give, and all they would say something like, Klee fan number 17 gets $4, whereas Kandinsky fan gets $3, or I have no idea what's going on there. Klee fan gets $5, whereas Kandinsky fan gets $5. Here is what in the first two sets of people, the Klee and Kandinsky fans and the dot counters and the mere group W's and group X's all seem to show the exact same tendency. In situations just like this, the people on average tended to pick this right here over this right here. In other words, what they evinced was they were not interested in the biggest payoff for their own groups. They were interested in the biggest possible difference between their own group and the other group. Think about that for a minute. We like to think, well, clearly people are going to favor their own group. No, it doesn't look like they did, right? Because that makes my group much better off than that one. And yet, what are you pushing your phone buttons or something? I'm getting some interference here. It's because I'm touching it. No touching. Okay. No, this would make my group way better off, yes? And yet they still preferred this. So in other words, what this reveals is that these folks felt like, I'm willing for my group to suffer more as long as the other group suffers more. Okay? The fancy word that psychologists use here is not just in-group favoritism, but out-group derogation. What I really need to do is stick it to the other people. Now, what I want you to think about here in these studies is how bizarre that is. Why? Ask any of these three experimental folks, why do you need to stick it to these other people? They like different paintings than I do. What about the second group? You need those people to suffer? Why? They don't count dots the way I like to count dots. Now look, you'd like to think at least you had some part in that, but this was true even in the case of being randomly assigned to either group W or group X. What is this person going to say? You need to stick it to group X. Why? Because of how X-y they are. I mean, you got nothing in that case, right? There's no grounds upon which to say this is the principal distinction between me and them, and that's why they need to suffer. No. And yet, these people were still that quickly able to behave in tribal ways toward their own tribe and against others as well. So we have these tendencies that are easily triggerable. And here is what Bill had concluded. It seems that the mere mention of groups by the experimenters was sufficient to produce strong intergroup discrimination. It was as if that just by inserting the word group into the experimental instructions, the subject's definition of the situation was radically altered. Let me tell you about, this goes farther. Not just do we have this tendency, human beings, to form groups and therefore to see outgroups as somehow the enemy that needs to suffer at our expense, even at our expense, right? But a wide variety of things can become identifiers of group membership. So I want to talk to you about this study conducted by Bishop and Anderson. All they were after, this was an educational study, all they were after in this study was to try to test the efficacy of a certain science curriculum. They were just trying to see how good does this particular curriculum program work. So they took over 100 college students, they gave them a pre-test, then those students really took the semester-long science curriculum, then they gave them a post-test. Interesting though, I mean, wow, this was what seems like the study should have been about. They asked in the pre-test and in the post-test of all the students, do you believe in evolution? And they had a wide spread. People could say, yes, I do believe in evolution. People could say, no, I don't. Or they could say, I'm unsure. And they asked again here. Once they had all the people's answers to pre and post test and their self-declared positions, the sort of like terrifying thing that they found was that believing in evolution made a person no more likely to get any of the pre-test questions correct. None. So a person who self-professedly said, I believe in evolution, was no more likely than a person who said that they did not to understand anything about random mutation, genetic variance, natural selection. And also interestingly, despite all having gone through the exact same curriculum, what they found was anybody who had declared a particular belief on the pre-test did not change their mind after the curriculum had passed. The only people that changed their mind on the backside of the curriculum were people who had declared themselves as unsure on the pretest. And in that case, some of them went to the I believe section, some of them went to the I don't believe section. But nobody who claimed to believe jumped ship to the other, nor did anybody who claimed not to believe jump ship to the other. This is puzzling. Why? Because it suggests that these declared beliefs aren't really tracking anything about a person's knowledge of the theory itself, right? Because turns out you can say you believe it and still not even know what it is that you believe, apparently. And it is not tracking the persuasiveness of the theory itself. Nobody was persuaded either way in terms of those people who already had a stated belief about the matter. So what is a belief in evolution tracking or a disbelief in evolution tracking? What kind of work are these things doing? Well, Dan Kahan, who's a law professor at Yale, conducted a survey study in which he found that what it did track very, very, very well was a person's self-reported level of religiosity. So whereas it in no way, shape, or form tracks a person's actual knowledge of the theory itself, it does seem to strongly correlate with that person's self-identified level of religiosity. Another researcher, Alan Mazur, did a similar survey study and found that it's also a pretty darn good predictor of whether or not a person self-identifies as conservative or liberal. So whereas that belief, that stated belief, is not tracking for the average person, average Joe like me, that I know anything about the theory or how persuasive I find the theory, it does seem to be tracking something about which group I belong to. It seems to be doing the work of saying, I'm on this team. This is what Dan Kahan concludes. In sum, whether people believe in climate change, like whether they believe in evolution, expresses who they are. In other words, I might have all kinds of beliefs that really aren't functioning as understanding of the world trackers. This is not meant necessarily, it's not functioning in my psychology as though I really am explaining to you how I think processes out there in the world work, separate and apart from me perceiving them. No, it's doing some other kind of work, namely telling you what team I belong to. Here is my tribe. Not only do we have these tribal tendencies, and not only can beliefs themselves be tribal identity markers, but it seems as though these tribal memberships and the beliefs themselves as markers are deeply intertwined with our sense of security and therefore our sense of fear from threat. So I want to tell you about this one. Kaplan and a group of neuroscientists took a group of people who had all strongly identified with particular political views. And what they did was put them in an MRI machine, and they would show them particular statements on a screen. Now, there was one set of statements that were just supposed to be common textbook beliefs that, hey, we tended to get wrong. And what they would do in the fMRI machine was show something like this. Well, you might think that this is true, something like that Edison invented the light bulb, and then they would show various and sundry data that really called that into question. Okay, so when folks who had previously said on a survey, yep, I believe that, were shown that statements like this in the fMRI, turns out wasn't much reaction at all. Things were, oh, okay, I guess he didn't, sure. But they had another set of statements. You might call these the control set of statements. They had another set of experimental statements, namely challenges to deeply cherished political beliefs. So they showed them statements like this. You might think gun laws should be stricter, but actually, and they would have various and sundry data, trying to game it so that whatever they showed the person challenged that particular person's cherished beliefs one way or the other. Now, the revealing part of this study isn't so much how do these people react when it came to post-survey. It's the brain activity that is so incredible. Because as soon as these people saw statements like this, the MRI scans showed activity in the brain very much like this. Yes, on a podcast interview, Kaplan told the interviewer, we found in these cases activity in the brain that is the exact part of the brain that would light up if you were running from a bear. Think then about the association between a person's tribal commitments, their belief markers as tribal commitments, and therefore their sense of safety and security. Let me give you one more example. A team, this was social psychologists, Castano led this one, and he had a bunch of people take a political survey where they could indicate the degree to which they identified with certain political commitments. How strongly do you agree with this statement? Would you rate yourself as, mildly political? Would you rate yourself as Democrat, extreme Democrat? I mean, they had scales of like how strongly do you feel about these things. Okay, so they took the survey, And then this is where things get interesting. They split people into two groups, and one group had to answer questions about death. So these were like short answer questions where they would say, in 5 or 6 sentences, but with as much detail as you can, describe exactly what it'll be like to die. You're thinking, maybe I shouldn't have participated in the study. But this is what they had them do. And they had 5 or 6 questions related to the experience of death. Now they had a second group of people who just answered questions about TV, the control group. All right, so here is how they rigged things. At this point, everybody, no matter which group you were in, everybody's computer said system failure, system failure. And then the experimenter would come in the room because, like, we just got some error message. What's wrong? And of course, the participant has no idea what's going on, right? Well, it was rigged. And so the experimenter, acts all frazzled and befuddled and click, 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 click. For some reason, it's the 27th escape push that will fix it, right? Not 26. You just have to, okay, right? We just think, push it harder and faster. That will fix it. Well, so there's the ploy, right? And here is what they had already decided they were going to say. Listen, because of the error, believe it or not, we still have your answers to the death questions, but we lost all your information to that first survey. Would you mind taking that survey again? And look, the participant's none the wiser. Okay, sure, I'll take it again. What they found was that compared to the control group, the TV answering folks, when they went round 2, their answers got more extreme. On all of those political questions, all the people who had to think about death very, very intimately for a few moments got much more extreme in their views. In other words, my identifying with those political views is doing a lot of work and making me feel safe and secure. And when those things seem threatened, it's as though I'm being physically attacked. So, what does that mean? That means as humans go, the average Joe has these tribal tendencies, and that those things are intimately linked with a sense of safety. And that means that there's lots of cases in which when I hear information, I'm going to process it probably in a very tribal way. Notice then, I might not be reacting to the content at all. Think of the evolution study. I just heard somebody believes or doesn't believe. And what's funny is that under controlled conditions, I can't even tell you what it is that they believe or don't believe, but I know I'm not on their team. Something like that. Okay, I would like to suggest to you that despite, now I hope you realize what's at stake here. I'm describing the average Joe, and we have 20 to 30 average Joes in our classroom every time that we're trying to teach people, including about topics that are tribalized. Now, I'm suggesting to you that there is hope. We are not stuck with just letting tribes fight each other and then just teaching whoever's still standing at the end, okay? It's much better than that, and in fact, much easier than that. And I want to show you one more study to suggest why there's hope. So, John Bullock and a team of political scientists conducted a political survey where people were asked tractable political questions. So these are things you really could go look up. Here was the percentage of unemployment at this year. During this president's tenure, inflation was at this rate, which was higher or lower than the previous term. These are things you could just go look up. Well, not only did Bullock find that people were really bad at answering these questions correctly, but that they answered them along incredibly predictable lines. They answered them in such a way that made their own party look far, far better than the other party. But here's what's bizarre. He says, let me do this again, but instead, here's what I'll do. I will tell people for every time you get the question correct or just admit that you don't know, you'll be entered into a drawing for a monetary reward. And in some cases, it was very, very, very little. Whereas like per question, it wasn't going to pay off very much. Hey, if you get it right, I'll give you a nickel. I mean, and in some cases, it was less than that. As soon as he introduced this incentive, he found all of those distinctions between people's tribes disappeared completely. And people were insanely more likely to get all of the questions correct. Now, listen, I don't tell you that to say, in order to teach students, you're going to have to pay them to get the questions correct. That's not the takeaway. The takeaway is this. Notice, under certain conditions, the point is, the average Joe, including my students, is not utterly and irredeemably tribal in the way that that person processes information. Rather, that is one mode by which they process information, but clearly, under other conditions, they can do differently. Investigative mode, where what matters now is sensitivity to evidence and getting things correct and being careful. And it's not about declaring my tribe, it's about finding about the way things are around here. So the challenge for me as an educator is I super duper want to know, how do I prompt that person? How do I get them to put that online anytime we're talking about things where that topic itself has been thoroughly tribalized? Okay, I'm going to tell you all the different tricks that I try to play, and they've been fairly successful for me. And I hope you'll find that some of them are adaptable to your field as well. Okay, I think it can be done, all right? I think it can be done. First, I want to talk about prevention. So before class even starts, before the topic even starts, before a class discussion about that topic even starts, is there anything I can do to head off these kinds of things? That is why I have handed you the piece of paper that is in front of you. I use what I call the civil discourse policy that I have borrowed from my own wonderful dean. Dean Castillo gave this to me, and I have rewritten it multiple times because of challenges that I faced in the classroom to make it as clear as I could. And on syllabus day, I show them this, I go over it, and I try to be as scary as I possibly can that I consider this document as sacred and as inviolable as the academic integrity policy of Rose State. And I try to make it incredibly clear that if you have if you really foresee yourself not being able to comply with these standards, this is not the class for you, you need to go now. And I have yet to have anybody object to it or have, frankly, a problem. But on day one, the kinds of things that you're reading about set a tone for what this is going to be like, what's expected of you, what you can expect, the kinds of safety that you can expect just by participating. I use that as well. Look, the other one's harder, and that has to do with being very, very honest about myself. Just because my students are average Joes, and therefore these psychology studies might reveal something about them to me, that doesn't change the fact that I am one too. And I have my own tribes, and therefore I have my own issues that matter to me a lot. They matter to me because they aren't doing the job of telling you how I think the world works, even if that's the way I sell it. They're doing the work of telling you who I am. They're doing the work of telling you who my loved ones are, and where I feel safe, and with whom I feel safe. And so I have to be very honest with myself that there may just be topics that for me, are just too close to home. I know I'm tribalized about that. I know that my tendency is not to be able to be very investigative about that. And so in those kinds of cases, I'm going to have to make a hard decision. I'm either going to have to decide, listen, I'm going to have to let that go and decide that I can actually present this with no sense of threat or tribal commitments on my part, or it's perfectly okay if I decide, hey, somebody can teach that topic, but I can't. But I can't. And that's going to require a great degree of self-awareness on my part about what my hot buttons are. And it's fine if I find out that for me, some topics, yeah, I'm not going to be the effective teacher on that topic. That's okay. There are plenty of other controversial topics for you to pick from that you can work with. Okay, that is me in the sense of prevention. But I'd like to talk to you now for the bulk of the time about what do I do in the moment when the topic is on the table. How do I guide? How do I manage such that I get a productive conversation that seems to be more investigative and less tribal? One thing I do is I avoid, like the plague, open, broad, undirected questions, okay? Gun control. Does anyone have any thoughts of any kind related to this in any way? I'm exaggerating here, but there are still degrees of broadness that I have found more or less just invite tribe members to stand and beat their drums and sing the song of their people loudly. Why? Because, listen, these are in many cases going to be very instinctive, primitive, gut kinds of reactions. And the scripts related to those tribal identities are scripts that are probably going to be very well rehearsed and therefore take very little effort to go through. And if, turns out, as being a human, if I can do something easier, I probably will, right? And so if it's much easier to simply voice my mantras of my tribe rather than have to engage in investigative mode, that is probably what I'll do. And when somebody gives me this wide, broad invitation to do something related to that topic, this is the easy thing I'm probably going to do. And for that reason, I don't invite it. Why? I'm going to ask for trouble. The thing that I like to do is I like to use specific cases, not topics, specific cases, and identifiable third parties. So let me give you an example of one. I'm going to show you a video that I show my students in my political philosophy class where they have to respond to a specific case.
A woman suing the TSA for an invasive pat-down at the Albuquerque Sunport speaks only with KOB Eyewitness News 4. Eddie Garcia joins us with why the woman and her lawyer think they have a strong case. Eddie.
Well, Joe, this California woman says that this TSA pat-down was nothing short of molestation. Now she says she hopes this lawsuit will stop the agency from doing it to anyone else. Crain of Carlsbad, California, spoke to KOB Eyewitness News 4 over the phone. She describes her experience during a TSA pat-down at the Sunport back in August.
Heavily concentrating on my breast area where I told her I had had a mastectomy the year previous. And it just seemed to go on and on.
Derceau says she felt humiliated as the extensive pat-down happened in front of her 17-year-old son and hundreds of other travelers.
I felt as though I didn't have any rights other than that I had to stand there and let them do what they wanted to do to my body.
She says she knew her rights had been violated, so she asked to speak to the supervisor who she thought would help. All the while her son stood by her side and could not remain silent anymore.
My son, who I'm very proud of, spoke up and said, I went through the metal detector and I did not get a pat down, to which the gentleman, the supervisor, said, well, you don't have proof.
That statement was the last straw for Derceau, so she contacted an attorney, Alex Brodsky, who says the whole ordeal violates the Fourth Amendment, which protects Americans from unreasonable search and seizure.
We think that these searches, given the invasiveness and given the extensiveness of these searches, are really more akin to something like a strip search. And certainly as a result, we think we have a strong case.
Because I don't think anybody should have to go through this.
Now the TSA says it's asking government security experts if there is any way to make these security pat-downs less invasive, but just as
Thorough. I let cut off a little bit. So I have the class watch this, and then I just do a couple more things. I have a slide where we just read the Fourth Amendment. I have another slide where I show a couple of pictures of things that TSA agents have found during pat-downs. And then I ask this question: if you were the judge or jury in this case, would you rule for Derceau or for the TSA? And I say, all those who would rule for Derceau, show me your hands. All those who would rule for the TSA, show me your hands. Now, the payoff here is they are responding to just this case. I did not say, what are your general thoughts about pat-downs? I did not say, what do you generally think of the TSA? I didn't say, do you want to go work for the TSA? I mean, I didn't invite anything other than, here is this case, here are the details we have about this case, who do you side with? And notice, they have limited response options. They do not have any more this broad invitation to sort of invite any, tribal tangents or rehearsed mantras. They're just going to have to say, in this case, here's how I would rule. I also use identifiable third parties. So I actually talk about marriage laws in this country, and I, in one of my classes, use this philosopher Claire Chambers, who argues against state-recognized marriage. Now, you might just say, like, hey, I could just start a class where I'm going to discuss marriage laws in this class. Again, I dare you. Let's see how tribal that gets and how much fun that is for you, okay? But in the case of an identifiable third party, we can't just be generically responding to a topic. We now have this person and her argument, and not anyone else's, and not the topic generally. So there might, and I try to tell students, look, you might have different views about this marriage topic, but you need to tell me what is wrong specifically with the position she identified and how she argued for it. Well, now I probably don't have any mantras for that. I probably don't have any tribal drum songs anymore. I'm going to have to just think about the person in front of me. I find that novel arguments and positions are the best. The reason being that not only can beliefs become tribal membership markers, but there are arguments in my tribes that quickly, that adopt a sort of like slogan-y status, such that it's not merely that I need to defend that position, but I need to use these very particular slogans to defend that position. And so my arguments are already locked and loaded because I have tribal mantras for the support as well as the position. So what I like to do is I like to find very off-the-wall kinds of position, not just the position, but the way it is argued for. So in the case of abortion, my students have to see something like this, where the person who argues in favor of abortion rights says, yes, I think that's right, even if the fetus is a person. Yes, I think that's right, even if the fetus does have a right to life. And in the case of a person who's against any abortion rights, he argues, first of all, not from any religious grounds whatsoever. He's personally an atheist. He says, even if the fetus is not a person, I still think this is wrong. Notice in cases like this, the mantras are off the table. So even if a person hears the term abortion, and again, my tribal spidey sense is getting, is tingling now. Notice this person is going to be searching and searching and not find anything when it comes time to look in the mantra bucket for how to argue about these things, right? Because they just won't even apply. Those arguments are not even applicable in a case like this. So guess what? This is the only option this person has in order to engage the topic at this point, because the mantras are gone. You're going to have to do some other work, much more careful work. Okay, so no room for tribal tangents, and everybody in the room gains a very realistic expectation about what can actually take place in a classroom. Listen, in a college classroom, we are not going to solve gun control in a 20-minute discussion, okay? We are not going to solve abortion in, a 10-minute introductory discussion to class. And hopefully, narrowing it down to just such a single case gives a student an impression of just how unrealistic to think it is that we were going to tackle some large topic like that. And it helps a student, I find, appreciate then the complexity of topics. Notice, if I narrow it in just this way, where there's just one specific issue, not just a specific issue, but now a specific person with just one specific argument, and that literally took us 20 minutes of going pro and con and pro and con. Now all of a sudden I realize, gee, then the larger topic must be much, much, much bigger than I thought that it was, and my t-shirt and my placard probably don't solve that. Okay, during the actual classroom discussion itself, I try very hard to very explicitly, and I mean with great explicitness, manage the actual responses. Now this is not my idea. I have to hat tip someone here, Michael Sandel, who's a political philosopher at Harvard, who wrote the book Justice. At one time, his course Justice was the highest enrolled course in the nation. He had thousands and thousands of students per section. He did it in just this fashion, meaning he would give a case and ask, would you say yes, would you say no, would you rule for Dussault, would you rule for TSA, whoever, and it was organized. Show of hands for the people who'd rule for Dussault. They would raise their hands. Show of hands for the people who'd rule for TSA. And he would say, now, let me hear from the TSA defenders. Who can give me a reason why you should rule in favor of TSA? Hands go up, he picks one. And this person gives his or her reason. Now, in order to avoid any repetition, he would say things like, does anyone have a different reason why we should rule in favor of the TSA? Or has so-and-so summarized what you guys take to be the case? Okay, now he moves on. Okay, for those who think you should favor Dussault, who can defend this position? Are there any other reasons? Notice you have carved out very, very distinct space for where people's positions go and where their arguments go. And now it's in regulating it in that way, I've also shown very broadly to everybody, I'm giving everyone an equal chance. I'm not allowing someone to just bang their drum and sing the song of their people. This is a very organized event by which we are trying to deal with just this case, and I want anyone on either side to participate in that. I also, in these cases, try to model active listening for multiple reasons, not just because it's helpful, because it's very easy, especially, look, when we're dealing with these hard topics, I am one of these average Joes too that has skin in the game sometimes, and so I can forget what I'm doing, and I can, without even realizing it, start to worry about whose side I'm on, which can cause me to misunderstand some people's comments. And that is precisely why it's important for me to model active listening, because that helps me to give the most charitable interpretation I can to student comments. And so when someone says something, and if I'm even slightly detecting blood pressure rising in myself, let me make sure I heard you right. Tell me if I heard you right. And then I repeat what the argument was. Now, it's not just to keep myself under control, but it is also a little trick to make sure I keep controlling the tone. So there might be students who are so tribalized about this that, listen, even when they are doing their best to work in investigative mode, they might not recognize that their tone still sounds a little drummy, And so in order to make sure that that tone doesn't ruin what I'm after in the discussion, I will repeat what they said, but notice it's up to me what tone I use when I repeat it. And now I have scrubbed the comment clean of the connotative effects that might have caused a problem. Instead, when it comes time for the other side's defenses or whatever, they hopefully are remembering what I just said, because I'm the last person to have said that content. And I shamelessly blame time management all the time. There is no reason you can't just say, like, now, there might be still more hands to go. And you might, let's be honest, you might detect that, and some of those hands are just furiously raised a little too high, you know? And so you're worried about that kind of volatility. Just say, listen, for time's sake, let's hear from the other side now. Hey, sometimes you might say something. Can anybody, within about 30 seconds or less, give me a reason in defense of why you would rule in favor of Terceau? Now you have already said, I do not want, your dissertation about why the TSA is evil, right? We want something that we can all understand within about a 30-second time frame. Okay, what I like about this is that all of the arguments and objections involved in these topics are addressed to me, not to each other. They are not reacting off of each other's sort of perhaps partly tribalized speech, even if they're trying their best not to. It's all coming at me. Now it's on me then to control the tone. I am the one who can scrub these comments and make sure that we are really focused on the content of that comment, the content of that reason, the content of that argument, not whatever tribal affiliations or baggage that might come with it. I also conduct group discussions. So in some of my class settings, what I will do is I will assign groups of anywhere from 2 to 4 to answer very directed questions about things like this. So I gave you the Claire Chambers example earlier. This is actually a portion of the worksheet that I hand out during that class period. And look, they actually get a chance to respond directly to what Chambers is arguing. I give them space to say I don't think Chambers was right, or I do think Chambers was right. And I give them that space even in the context of 2 to 4 people who also are going to say what they think or don't think. And I have found that this is a gold mine here, this C option right here. Why? Because as long as it's safe and open for them to say our group was divided, now they realize the point of this assignment was not to convert each other. The point of this assignment was not to reach consensus. The point of this assignment isn't to all agree. There's something else at stake here, perhaps our critical thinking skills, our ability to analyze, our ability to hear each other's arguments and be able to write them down. I have to listen pretty carefully. If I'm the group secretary, now I have to listen a little bit, even to the people who are like, oh no, I don't think it is that. I disagree with you and here's why. I'm gonna have to write that down. Notice, as long as I have this option, I did it again, sorry. As long as I have this option, nothing hangs on the other people in the group disagreeing with me. It's fine. And now I get the idea that, hey, not only are we disagreeing, but we're actually getting this assignment done well, and agreement wasn't a prerequisite of getting it done well. Having the same views about these things wasn't a necessary part of doing this well. So in those cases, I get discussions where people really are passionate. It's not like they're withholding the fact that they care about a lot of these things. I hear student comments that are extremely honest with each other. But what's funny is because I've directed it in just such this way, what I hear are passionate investigators. I don't hear tribal songs anymore because they have a very particular task that is much more cerebral because of how directed it is, that they're going to have to write about. And they literally have to be very intimately close with people that may or may not agree with what they're saying. And they still have to turn the assignment in with that person, not against that person. The other thing I like to do in group discussions is just assign a position. It's not up to you, but you get to argue. It's up to me. And I will just say like, okay, you know what? This group is going to argue for this, whereas this group's going to argue for this. Now notice, it might happen as a matter of accident that somebody gets a position they happen to agree with, but there's a chance they won't, and yet I will still design the assignment in such a way that their grade depends on doing this well, which forces them now to do some work of trying to argue for things that perhaps they don't agree with, and therefore to understand the strengths and weaknesses of arguments. They can't all just say, well, they must all be bad, so we get an F. They probably don't want that F, right? So they're probably going to try to argue strongly, even in a case where they don't agree with the conclusion. Now, guess who's involved in that investigative mode doing some critical reasoning? One way I like to do this that's been a lot of fun is I do a mock trial where I randomly assign positions as well. So I will take, I split them into 3 groups, and I'll take 3 cases, and it's just luck of the draw, which one you were the defense on, which one you were the prosecution on, which one you got to judge. And it's pretty interesting to see. What's funny about this is to see how passionate they will get about this. And I even talked to them about, do you realize how silly this is? Because you realize if you had literally just sat there, right? I mean, they will, because they will argue, can't you just see? You know, and what's funny, you know, is I tell them, you realize you're getting all worked up about this, and you had no idea what you were going to argue before you walked into the room. This was news to you. And if you'd sat right there, you'd be like, no, can't you just see? You know, and so what you get is people who really have to work at, well, I don't know if I agree with this or not, but I'm about to argue for it. I'll tell you that right now. This is a case where you can hijack people's tribal tendencies to actually do good work. So that forces them to, this is the sneaky payoff, right? It's not just that they have to operate in investigative mode, but if you do set up students in such a way that they end up with positions that they don't necessarily agree with, you force them to really think about what it would be like to be inside the mind of an out-group member, somebody not of my tribe. There's a whole lot of empathy that can result from those kinds of exercises where people don't seem like out-group members anymore, but somebody that I actually understood one time, you know, when I was in a class doing this exercise. Now, I find it incredibly important to congratulate them, to make it very clear how good they're doing when they do engage in this kind of discourse, civil discourse. I point out, at the end of every semester, I point out, listen, do you guys realize you sat at tables for 16 weeks now, and you've talked about marriage laws, and you've talked about sexuality, and you talked about abortion, and nobody, like, got stabby, you know? Nobody unfriended each other, right? Nobody, like, you know, started some sort of social media tirade to boycott another person's business. You guys actually just looked face to face at other people who might not have agreed with you and just did the work of talking it out. And listen, I mean, the idea is like, don't let good behavior go unacknowledged. And you can reinforce habits in that way. Okay, what about while you're actually doing the presentation? So we talked about, like, what if I'm having an entire classroom discussion? I've told you that sometimes I don't do that. I have group discussions. But what about during my presentation? What kinds of things can I do to offset or circumvent or prevent these kinds of tribal obstacles? I would like to talk to you about buzzwords a little bit. I don't mean this in a super jargony way. I just want to use that word to refer to any terms that come up in discussions where that term seems to be doing more connotative work than it is denotative work. Words that seem to do more affective work than cognitive work, that seem to be more blood pressure-y than calculatory, okay? Now, I want to show you a video because I'm sure you all are aware that we have buzzwords in life, and we are so permeated with buzzwords that there are tons and tons of parodies of just how responsive to buzzwords we are.
You get an I Met a Congresswoman sticker.
Thank you. Finally, that's all I wanted was
This country was founded on certain principles.
Oh, brother.
Freedom, troops, America, flag. Now, I might not know where I'm going with this, but I know we will get there together. Who loves pizza?
Griffin, what are your plans for cleaning up our environment?
9/11.
Mrs. Griffin, what about our traffic problem?
9/11.
Look, there wouldn't be jokes on TV about it if there wasn't some truth to mock. Point being, there are some words that we almost don't care what the measurable, tractable, denotative content of that word is. It's not doing that kind of work. It's doing some other kind of work, rallying the troops, singing the songs of my tribe. Now, whereas those might be joke examples, there are very serious examples where just by the mere use of a word, I can activate people's tribal tendencies. So here are some examples. I find that if I'm going to use anything that I think is even remotely close to one of these buzzwords, I have, before we talk about it at all, I've got to define it in a tractable, measurable way, and I keep beating them over the head with that definition throughout the entire discussion. I always use a definition such that I can, in the discussion, exchange the word for the definition without any loss in meaning. So, and I will remind them, if somebody says, yes, I think it is this way, I will say, wait, so you think, I go back to the definition, that it meets this condition and this condition? I put it that way. This way they can't be, oh yeah, that connotative, I do think it's that way. Nope, that's not what I asked you. I asked you about this definition. Now look, I hate to say it, sadly, unfortunately, okay, there are some words that might, for whatever reason in public discourse, be so thoroughly tribalized that they're not worth it anymore. It's not worth the trouble. The costs are frankly too high. You are not going to get the productivity that you want out of that discussion. So I'll give you an example. I teach a couple of different classes about implicit bias, and I try very, very hard that entire discussion never one time to mention the word racism. Why? Because inevitably a student will, but I didn't. And listen, when that happens, they bring up the buzzword. If you don't think racist is a buzzword, go around here shouting it and see how that goes, okay? All right? So it's a buzzword. It is more evocative than cognitive. So when a student, wait, is this like fill in the buzzword? I say something like, well, hold on, what exact, I stop them. We can't go forward until you define that term for me. I don't allow this buzzword with all its connotative baggage just to slip right in and then ruin this whole thing I was trying to do. And in most cases, I find they don't have a definition. They're really trying to be buzzy with that word. Not in the sense that their intention is to hijack the discussion, but that this really is their mental association between the topic we're talking about and that buzzword. That really is the connection that they're drawing. Oh, well, is this like this? But they still, the content of that word is extremely vacant in terms of denotation, tractability, measurability. And so I say like, well, if you don't have a definition, let's just stick with this word, implicit bias, implicit bias. And I've avoided tons of problems that way. I mean, tons of people who definitely wanted to say like, well, I'll tell you what's racist. Hey, you know what? This isn't a class about that, unless you're going to give me a definition. And when they can't, I say, then let's keep talking about implicit bias. So the other thing that I like to do, especially in the case of potential buzzwords, in other words, there might be lots of terms you realize that we as educators think of in a very jargony, denotative way, but listen, because of whatever the hot news issue is of the day, has adopted this other connotative, pregnant meaning to it, yes? And because of that, I might still want to use that word, I might still use the definition. Another trick that I make sure it's very tractable and measurable is I am always sure to attach that term to a specific person who advocates the position relative to that term and uses that term in that precise way. And again, that actually disarms the discussion, because I can say things something like this. I can say, listen, I realize some of you probably use this word in other ways, but philosopher Claire Chambers uses it in this way. So for today's discussion, we're just going to use it in that way. And that, listen, that leaves them room to walk out of the room and decide, I'm never going to use that word that way again. Okay, but in the context of this discussion, now they had to. And they had to because, listen, I picked the material for today, and it was this philosopher, and this is how this person uses that term. Let's just follow suit. It'll be easier all around. And I find very little resistance to that, typically. But, the reason being, too, as soon as you have vague and... I did it again, didn't I? Oh, it didn't do it. I lost my touch. Okay. As soon as you have vague and undefined sources for these terms, you allow students mental space to fill in the blanks about where these things come from. And you know what's really handy when it comes time to fill in those blanks is to think whether or not that's a member of my tribe or not a member of my tribe. Oh, is it like us or is it those people? Well, now if I just say, no, it's literally Claire Chambers, the philosopher who works in the University of Leeds. Oh, well, is she a Republican? Okay. Is she a Democrat? She's British? I mean, right? Now it's off the table. In other words, even if I wanted to, I don't have the means anymore to very easily tribalize her as well as a part of the discussion and the way that I'm going to go about the discussion. What if I just need to teach them the facts? Look, there's some times when I just need to tell them, hey, here is what this philosopher said, or here is what the research suggests, something like that. One thing that I try to do is to present research in a very, very narrative fashion. I don't just say like, okay, these two guys in a lab like solved that. Remember that. Okay, I don't ever present it that way. Rather, I say, look, let's tell the story of exactly what this group of folks did. They set up the study this way. They collected their specimens this way. Here's the exact procedures they went through. Here's what they find. And during that process, I try as openly as I can to welcome questions, tests, analysis. Let them be skeptical. Let them ask, well, wait, but did they do it this way? And if I don't know, I say, I don't know. I let it hang like that. Let me give you an example, because again, implicit bias is probably one of the toughest things that I talk about in a classroom. So I cover the philosopher Jennifer Saul. She has this other paper related to this topic because she's arguing about the relationship between implicit bias and classical skepticism. In order to teach that at all, I have to say something about what implicit bias is and why I think there is such a thing at all. And so part of what I do in class is I go through all of the research that she covers in her papers in a very narrative fashion to try to get them to see, here's what all these people did, what conclusion should we draw? So one of the things that she talks about is a 2002 study by Crain and Park about shooter bias, where they had a mixed group of participants, mixed gender, mixed ethnicity. And they played a video game where they were shown people on a screen. For those of you old schoolers like me, if you remember like Hogan's Alley, or maybe Duck Hunt, but Hogan's Alley, okay? You've shown pictures on a screen where a person is just in a normal environment, but that person's holding an object. And in some cases, the person is holding a harmless object like a cell phone or a soda can, but in other cases, the person is holding a weapon. Now, the people playing the video game, their job, they had 2 buttons and only 2 buttons. They had a shoot button and a don't shoot button. The idea is they were instructed to play this video game. If and when you see an armed target, you need to press the shoot button as quickly as you possibly can. When you see an unarmed target, you need to press the don't shoot button as quickly as you possibly can. And I say, look, here's the number of participants they use, here was the diverse makeup of that group, and here, after running these trials over and over and over again, here is what they found. That everyone in the entire study tended to shoot faster when a black guy had a gun versus when a white guy had a gun. Listen to it again. Everyone in the study. The ethnicity of the participant made no difference whatsoever to their reaction times. And everyone in the study tended to make the same mistakes. When a target was unarmed and black, people were more likely to shoot than when the target was unarmed and white. So this is as far as I go. I have like 4 or 5 others that she talks about. I go through them all. I never say, therefore you better believe it. I leave it at that. They ask me questions. Wait, was the game this way? Wait, how fast? What was the time difference between the reaction time? I always let them ask all these questions. And the idea is, after they do that, I haven't told them anything about what to believe. I haven't told them anything. Well, now you clearly must believe that they've had to wrestle with the data themselves. And at no point do I just say, Crain and Park, therefore, order you to believe that there's implicit. No, we never go there. And the point is I don't have to. I don't have to. I am trying as hard as I can just to let data speak for itself and let what I hope are junior critical thinkers into wrestling with data. And therefore, to have to wrestle their way to a conclusion. Notice, I get resistance. I still get people that are skeptical. But in those cases where they're skeptical, what's good about this is now they have to still explain this data. They don't get to well, I have general mantras about that. No, hold on, slow down. Let's talk about this study. If this all happened in your lab, you tell me what it means then. And now this person, even if they're resistant, they don't have tribal mantras for that. They're going to have to be in investigative mode. Now, listen, I try very, very, very hard to always avoid presenting science as just the be-all, end-all, no matter what the study is. I try very hard to avoid anything that sounds like this. I'm just telling you, listen. As soon as if a student's being resistant, listen, I'm just telling you the facts. I hope you're hearing buzziness now. I'm just telling you this person is the expert. I appreciate that, you might not say it in the weird gravelly way I just did, but I appreciate that for us who have gone through a lot of education ourselves just to be educators, that these things do have jargony denotative meaning for us, that we are not trying to be untrue to. The point is whether or not the people I'm communicating with will hear them in that way. And the problem is there are circumstances under which my presentation might be more likely to activate in them a tribal processing of those very terms, where, listen, that is not what they heard. I appreciate that this has a rude gesture on it, and I appreciate your guys are reacting, but I wanted you to. Listen, think about that for a minute. If you find this off-putting in the slightest, for some of you, I can tell by your faces you find it very off-putting. Go me. Anyway, so, okay, it worked. Listen, if you find this off-putting at all, think about how your student feels when what they heard by the facts and expert is your tribe is bad and wrong. Whereas you might think, listen, it might be so clear to you, that's not even the topic. We're not talking about tribes. I'm just telling you this is what science is like. Science doesn't care what you believe. Your student cares what your student believes. And your student's tribe cares about what your student believes. And so if I'm ever going to reach those people, I better respect and be careful and show that I mean no threat to their beliefs either. So I don't want for them to have this experience when it comes time for me to teach them the data, the research, the science. I don't know why I need it. It's clearly going to be an obstacle, not a help. Think about how these people are going to hear it. I'm just telling you the facts. Tribal processing is going to tell them, oh, that thing I have to believe or my tribe is wrong. If that doesn't strike you as very inviting, it probably doesn't strike them that way either. The expert, that person that you better just take his or her word for it, or your tribe is wrong. I don't want my students to have that experience because I want them to be able to operate in a classroom where this isn't even what's at issue. It's not even what's at issue. We're trying to operate in investigative mode. And when I present data and research in that way, I'm actually not encouraging critical thinking. I'd like to suggest, well, now listen, however tribally motivated my students might be when they're resistant, when they're skeptical to data and to research on these topics, however tribally motivated that might be, I'd like to suggest to you they're behaving like good scientists, not bad ones. When a person had to send off, when Carell and Park had to send off their shooter bias study to a peer-reviewed journal, it's not like the people at the peer-reviewed journal were like, oh, we're so glad, we just know it's flawless. We'll just go ahead and publish this tomorrow. Rather, they had specialists in the field that reviewed this paper, and those persons' job were to look at it as skeptically and as untrusting as they possibly could. It was their job to say, I'm going to assume this is wrong and I'm going to find the flaws. And it's only after that peer review process that they say, like, wow, I really didn't find any, that the paper gets published. And even then it's not off the hook. It gets published in a journal, and now it's the job of the community at large to write papers that, well, I know Carell and Park argued this, but we did the same thing and didn't get the same result. It's literally the community's job now to be skeptical, to be untrusting. This is not a behavior I want to discourage in my students. I don't want that. Listen, it might be tempting and it might be frustrating for all of the reasons I need to teach them things and grade their papers. Can't you just accept the paper? You know, okay? We could get to the test so much faster if you just would. Okay, but listen, I'm hoping that what I don't sell them is just a new tribe. That's not what I'm trying to create. I'm trying to create students who can do much, much more with their cognitive faculties than just beat tribal drums. And so I don't want to just say like, no, you're on my tribe now, or else what? You get an F? Well, exactly. I mean, there might be cases where I still have to grade their papers. I still need them to mark A instead of D. I still need them to choose true instead of false. Okay, but I just want you to think back to this evolution study where their self-reported beliefs did no work in indicating how well they understood a theory. So if my goal here is to get them to say, okay, I believe in evolution, they still might not know what that means. In other words, that might not be the worthy goal that I'm after. And so they might, when they see questions like that, read them in tribal fashions. And instead of trying to answer in such a way that says something about the content and therefore the state of affairs in the world, they might answer it in such a way like, oh, this is really a question about who I am. And when I'm confronted with questions like that, it's time to be a loyal tribe member. Now you might think, look, if you don't want to do, listen, I think it's, Dan Kahan says, why not just barely word the question different and you give them an out? They have a completely different experience. In this study, he decided to run it this way, according to the theory of evolution. And he found that all of those distinctions between identities disappeared. Now all of a sudden, this person's identity is not on the line by just a true or false question. Otherwise, when you say like, you better mark that true, I'd like you to stop and consider what you're asking a student to do, okay? Despite the fact that you might just think like, I want you to mimic a textbook because that makes grading lots easier, okay? A student might not experience it in that way. Instead, they might feel like they're getting this ultimatum. Either I get that question right or my tribe is on the line. Ask yourself which one you would choose. I mean, we have tribes for reasons. It helps us get on in life. And in lots of those cases, I would probably just say, I'll just say false then, and I'll be true to my tribe. Or I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to lie about what I really think, just so I don't get in trouble with my tribe. I don't know why. Think about, why do I need a student to go through that, to learn about any of these things? Do I need it? I mean, if the answer is no, I don't need it, then I don't know why I would create that obstacle for them. I don't know why it needs to come up. I don't know why this needs to be what's at issue. I can easily make it not the issue with these things like these according to phrases. All right, last and briefly is nothing is foolproof. You are going to still get somebody who's going to be tribal. You're going to get somebody who is borderline uncivil, if not uncivil, okay? My methods are not flawless. I can tell you I've had extremely few incidents. And in fact, as soon as they happened, the person realized right away what had happened and it disappeared as quickly as that. But I'd still like to say, you still have occasions upon which, despite all of your best preventative and management guidance efforts, somebody still seems or appears to cross that line in terms of the quality of discussion that you're after, the kinds of comments that you want to have, okay? So after someone has been civil, what do? First of all, I want you to recognize that even after it happens, all is not lost. The temptation is like, oh, it happened anyway, I guess it's lost. No, it's not lost. No one has to control the tone of the room unless you let them. And so even if that person who makes this comment that might be suspect or might be blatant, how you respond to it can still dictate how the tone of the room is going to go. And so in lots of cases, especially when it's a borderline case, especially when tone is suspect, it's not obvious that there was a big problem, but it was fishy enough that you can read the temperature of the room. You saw other people get a little uncomfortable, something, okay? Redirect. I try as hard as I can to redeem what was just said. Can I ask them a question such that despite how tribal or perhaps uncivil that just sounded, can I ask them a question where they still have to deal with what they said in an investigative way? I say something like, well, wait, what you're saying right now, how exactly does that address Claire Chambers' position? Wait, are you sure that that meets up with this term? And all of a sudden they have to do that investigative work again. They can't just keep tribal mantras going. Look, in some cases, a comment might just be bizarre. It might just be bizarre. Or charitable interpretation, maybe whatever redeeming properties it has, you're just, in the moment, you're not going to see. You're not going to get it. You're not going to flawlessly understand everything everybody was out to say that day. Okay, move on. I've had people, say something. Wait a minute. Say that again in different words. They say it again. Wait, how does that address this? I still didn't get it. Okay, who else? It's over. It's over. You don't have to let it ruin the entire tone of the room. You control the tone of the room. Just keep going. All is not lost until you admit defeat about such things. Now, some cases are going to be blatant. Some cases really are like, look, that was uncalled for. Reaffirmed. That is why I've got a civil discourse policy. Now, look, there is no reason that when you do that, there's no reason that it needs to be hostile or aggressive at all. I've never felt the need. I don't know why I need to feel the need to do that. Again, as soon as I respond in this combative way with the civil discourse policy, I've already kind of given in that this is a tribal contest and that I will win. There is no such contest here. I am setting a completely different tone in this room. I can just say like, listen, I think that goes beyond the civil discourse policy. Just don't let it happen again, but that's okay. Do you want to try again? Let them try again if they want to. Sometimes if they're heated enough, they'll just quit and you can move on. You've still maintained the tone of the discussion. You can still get those same goals met despite the fact somebody really did mess up. That is what it's there for. That is what it's there for. I will tell you that one and only one time did I have a blatant violation. And in fact, it wasn't violent. It wasn't a massive outburst. Somebody referred to a presidential candidate using a slur. And that was the one and only time. What's funny is, I talk about controversial things in my topics. I mean, I have an entire class about bullshit, believe it or not, where philosophers argue about what that is. And so people have to be exposed to that word. But here was a case where no, we're not talking about any sort of redeemable property of that term that you just used. We just addressed it. It was a co-teacher and I. He just said, that one, whereas I realize we've talked about some of these harder topics, that went too far, don't let it happen again. It was over. It was over. It was fine. And we kept talking. Not all is lost unless you decide it's lost. And that's the good news. You can keep controlling the tone even in the face of what seem like blatant violations of civil discourse. That is all I have to say. That's all I have to say. Are there any questions?